When I looked down and saw crimson all over my hands, my heart just about stopped. I thought, oh no, what the hell did I just do? But hold up, nobody called the cops. It was only beet juice. Claudia had knocked over a jar of it when I caught her. Yep, caught her. Mid-pour with a container of unidentified garden treatment. Aimed straight at my harvest, like she was some kind of villain in a gardening-themed soap opera. We all know that neighbor, the one who acts like your property's just an extension of their lawn. Well, mine's Claudia Berkeley. She tried to wipe out my entire crop, and I got her cold, red-handed, beet-stained, whatever. If you've got a Claudia in your life, I want to hear your war stories in the comments. Who knows, maybe yours is worse than mine. Though good luck topping this. I'm currently being sued for $2 million because I locked Claudia in my root cellar after she trespassed. But hey, what do you do when someone tries to poison land your family's cared for across 3 generations? You don't just wave and bake them a pie, right? So here's how we got here. My name's Ethan Whitaker. A few years back, I was a software engineer drowning in downtown Boston life. Condo stacked with overpriced gadgets, a caffeine addiction only Starbucks could love, and a commute that aged me a decade. Then Grandpa passed away. Left me his 5-acre patch of paradise in rural Vermont. I used to spend summers there as a kid, barefoot, sunburned, covered in dirt and joy. So, like any sane 41-year-old fed up with city life, I ditched the concrete jungle, sold my condo, sweet-talked my boss into letting me work remote, and headed for the middle of nowhere to half code, half farm. And let me tell you, it was perfect. The farmhouse stood like a relic from the 1940s, stubborn and proud. The greenhouse? Still solid. The chicken coop needed some love, but the hens didn't seem to mind. And the crown jewel? The root cellar. Grandpa built it into a hill, like a secret bunker for vegetables. It even had lights, shelves, and a composting toilet in the corner, because he believed in backup plans. Turns out, so did I. The first half year felt like a dream. I had a routine, clickety-clack on the keyboard by day, pull weeds and water plants by evening, and spend weekends patching up the old place with care and elbow grease. My nearest neighbors lived 3/4 mile down the road, sweet retired couple who'd swing by with jam and stories. They were just happy to see life on the farm again. I was too. It felt like I had finally escaped the madness of the city. Then the tranquility got sucker punched. Enter Claudia Berkeley. She moved into the modern monstrosity next door, a glass and steel eyesore dropped in the middle of rural charm, like someone dropped a Miami nightclub into a cornfield. Pool, fancy landscaping, and more sprinklers than sense. Claudia herself was 54, looked 40, and clearly spent a fortune making it so. She carried herself like royalty who got lost on the way to her castle, and now she wanted to gentrify the countryside. Our first meeting should have been a red flag the size of Texas. I was minding my business collecting eggs when I heard a sharp little throat clear behind me. I turned around, and there she was, Claudia, standing on the edge of my land in pristine hiking gear that looked like it came from a catalog labeled "Luxury Outdoors for People Who Hate Dirt." "You know," she said, squinting at me over her designer shades, "those chickens of yours make a horrible ruckus in the morning. Some of us value our rest." I calmly explained that it was roosters that crow, not hens, and I didn't keep any roosters. You'd think I'd told her I bathed with goats. She made a face, spun around, and walked off without another word. That was just the opening act. Within weeks, I started getting love letters from the county. Complaints about my chicken coop, my compost pile, even the alleged height of my tomato plants. Apparently, they were a national threat. Every single report got investigated. Every single one got dismissed. But the message was clear. Claudia was trying to bury me in paperwork and noise ordinances. When that didn't work, she shifted gears. Started throwing these extravagant backyard events. Wine fountains, valet parking, the whole deal. I was never invited, of course, but my elderly neighbors told me the real agenda was Claudia's speech circuit, where she warned the whole block that my hobby farm was tanking property values. Then came the cherry on top. A realtor showed up one afternoon with a creepy grin and an insulting offer for my land, barely 40% of what it was worth. When I laughed and told him to scram, he let it slip. The buyer was willing to make life difficult if I didn't sell. Gee, wonder who that could be. That night, I installed my first set of cameras. Took less than a week for the cameras to earn their keep. One evening, I was checking footage when I spotted a shady figure creeping near my chicken coop. Guess who? Claudia. And she wasn't just snooping. She had a small cage in hand. I watched as she opened it and scurried away like a cartoon villain. The next morning, I found paw prints and claw marks. Something had definitely tried to get at my hens. Lucky for me, the coop held strong. Not so lucky for Claudia's plan. I took the footage straight to Sheriff Granger, a grizzled old-school type who'd been around the county longer than some of the Barnes. He frowned through the video and said he'd have a word with her. Not enough for charges, he said, but maybe a warning'll do the trick. Spoiler alert, it didn't. If anything, that warning just poured gasoline on her fire. And over the next month, things got even worse. One morning I walked outside and saw garden hoses sliced clean like someone had used a samurai sword. My trash scattered across the driveway like raccoons and hosted a rave. And one day, there was this weird chalky powder sprinkled all around the edge of my veggie garden. I had no clue what it was, but I didn't take chances. I hosed it down like it was radioactive. Every time something happened, I reported it. And every time, Sheriff Granger gave me that same tired look. No hard evidence, no charges. Claudia was slick. She never left fingerprints, just chaos. That's when I decided to upgrade my security, not just a few cameras. I went full paranoid prepper mode, especially around the root cellar. I was finally harvesting my heirloom crops, stuff I'd babied since spring, rare varietals I'd hunted down from seed libraries across the country. These weren't just vegetables. They were a tribute to my grandfather and a whole summer's worth of sweat and soil. I added more cameras, a silent phone alert system, and a hidden electronic lock I could control from anywhere. Honestly, I felt a little ridiculous installing a panic room grade system for carrots and beets. But now, best grand I ever spent. Come fall, Claudia changed tactics again. This time, she started telling neighbors I was growing illegal substances in my root cellar. Apparently, in Claudia's mind, potatoes were a gateway drug. Enough folks bought into her nonsense that Sheriff Granger had to come by and check things out. He looked like he hated every second of it. Sorry, Ethan, he mumbled, peering at jars of pickled beets. Small town gossip. You know how it goes. Gotta check every report, even the dumb ones. He left satisfied, but the damage was done. Suddenly, I couldn't go into town without someone squinting at me like I was Walter White with a watering can. Late October, one quiet night, I was buried in code when my phone buzzed. Security alert. I checked the feed and my blood ran cold. There was Claudia, in a fleece vest, crouched like a burglar, fiddling with the decoy padlock on my root cellar. She was using a hairpin like she'd watched too many spy movies. What she didn't know was that the real lock, hidden underneath, was electronic and miles smarter. She slipped inside, lugging a heavy canvas tote. I watched, jaw on the floor, as she pulled out a massive bottle of weed killer, industrial grade, the kind that probably came with a skull and crossbones label. She scanned the room like a Bond villain, deciding where to strike first. Everything I'd grown, hundreds of pounds of vegetables, stacks of preserves, literal blood, sweat, and beet juice, was seconds from being nuked. My thumb hovered over the phone's lock button. Part of me hesitated. Was I really about to lock a grown woman in my cellar? Is this who I was now? Then I remembered the sliced hoses, the whispered lies, the dead-eyed county inspector asking me if my tomatoes were too tall. This wasn't about revenge. It was about stopping someone who was clearly out for blood, or beets. I knew that Vermont law allows for temporary detention at the scene of a crime if it does not endanger the person, and I took care of her safety. I took a breath and tapped the button. A soft click came through the speaker. Claudia froze, spun around, and rushed to the door. Too late. Locked. What followed was a full-blown meltdown. Claudia banged on the door, shouting about lawsuits, jail time, and how this is literally a war crime. But she wasn't in danger. The cellar had lights, ventilation, even a composting toilet. I wasn't throwing her in a dungeon. I was just keeping her in timeout until the sheriff could deal with her properly. "I've caught the intruder in the act," I muttered to myself as I dialed Sheriff Granger. He answered on the fourth ring, voice scratchy and annoyed. It was almost 10:45 p.m. I laid it all out: video proof, clear intent, chemical weaponry. "She's locked in, safe and warm," I told him, "just waiting for you." Sheriff sighed. "I'm across the county handling a pileup. 45 minutes minimum. You sure she's secure?" "Safe as a kitten in a playpen," I said. He told me not to engage, just monitor her. I agreed and hung up. Meanwhile, Claudia stopped screaming long enough to make a phone call. I couldn't hear much, but I had a good idea who was on the other end. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, headlights swept my driveway. A sleek black Mercedes purred to a stop, and out stepped Richard Berkeley, Claudia's husband and a corporate attorney, so successful, he probably billed his own sleep. He looked like the villain in every legal drama ever. Silver temples, tailored coat, shark-like stare. Before he could even knock, I opened the door. "Where is my wife?" he snapped, skipping greetings entirely. His voice was smooth, cold, and just threatening enough to be legal. "She's in my root cellar," I said calmly, holding up my phone. "I've got live footage of her breaking in with Weed Killer. She's locked in, unharmed. Sheriff's on the way. Want to see the footage?" I didn't wait. I hit play and showed him the exact moment she picked the lock and stepped in with her chemical payload. His poker face cracked just enough. Eyes widened, jaw twitched. He tried to regroup. "That may look incriminating," he said, "but you can't imprison someone. That's a serious offense." I shrugged. "Sheriff's aware. He's fine with it. She's not a prisoner. She's a trespasser waiting for law enforcement. Would you like to wait inside or freeze out here?" It was in the low 40s, and his $1,000 suit looked about as warm as a paper napkin. Richard followed me in, his expression carved from stone. I offered him coffee. He declined like I'd handed him a mug full of raccoon spit. We sat in silence, both watching the security feed like it was a reality show neither of us wanted to be in. Claudia had stopped pacing and was now sulking on the bench near the shelves, occasionally yelling something about how I'd just ended my own life. Buddy, if only she knew. Once Claudia realized her knight in tailored armor had arrived, she turned her drama dial to 11. She stared straight into the security camera and started flipping between helpless hostage and vengeance-crazed supervillain. "Help me, I'm being held against my will," she whined. Then immediately followed it with, "I will own this entire property when I'm done with you." What she clearly hadn't clocked was that her tote bag of chemical doom was still sitting in plain view of the lens, front and center like product placement. Then I caught her on another feed trying to dump the Weed Killer down the cellar's floor drain, thinking she was slick. I just smiled. She had no idea that little drain didn't go into the ground. Nope, it flowed straight into a sealed runoff tank I'd installed just to test soil contamination. Every last toxic drop she poured was getting bottled up as evidence. Richard noticed too. He gave me this weird side glance, part disbelief, part reluctant respect. "You really thought of everything," he muttered, like he hated saying it out loud. When someone spends half a year trying to sabotage your life, you learn to stay ready, I said, trying not to sound smug. By the time Sheriff Granger arrived, we were gathered around my kitchen table like we were about to play poker. Except the cards were months of meticulously logged Claudia crimes. I had everything: photos, timestamps, video, a whole Claudia dossier. The sheriff sifted through it slowly, each page making his frown deeper. Meanwhile, Richard was half in lawyer mode, half texting furiously, probably updating Claudia or calling in some corporate favor. Granger finally looked up, his face hard as a winter frost. "This is one hell of a pattern, Mr. Berkeley," he said flatly. I've responded to more complaints from your wife than I can count. All bogus. But this? He tapped the weed killer footage. This is criminal. Richard cleared his throat, voice suddenly softer. Sheriff, perhaps we can find a less formal solution here. My wife may have shown, let's say, poor judgment tonight. I couldn't help myself. I cut in, louder than I intended. Poor judgment? She broke into my property with enough poison to nuke a Whole Foods and tried to erase an entire season's worth of crops. That's not bad judgment, it's sabotage. Granger nodded slowly. I agree, but I'm willing to give you both a choice. The sheriff looked between us like a school principal breaking up a playground fight. I can arrest Mrs. Berkeley right now. Charges would include breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, maybe more depending on the chemical tests. He paused. Or you two can come to an agreement, one that ensures this kind of behavior ends and Mr. Whitaker is fairly compensated. Richard sat up straighter, smoothing his tie like it was armor. What kind of agreement are you proposing? I'd been thinking about that very thing while waiting for him to show up. Full compensation for damages. A legal agreement saying your wife will never step foot on my land again. And an honest explanation about why she's so obsessed with running me off. Because this ain't about chickens anymore. For a brief second, Richard's poker face cracked. Barely, but it was enough. He nodded carefully, choosing each word like he was defusing a bomb. I can agree to compensation and a no-contact order. But as for motives, they are what they appear. Concerns about neighborhood aesthetics. Yeah, and I'm the Easter Bunny. Before I could call that bluff, Granger's radio squawked, another deputy checking in. The sheriff responded, then stood. I think it's time we heard from Mrs. Berkeley herself. I unlocked the cellar using my phone, the app giving a quiet chirp as the bolt released. The three of us, me, the sheriff, and Richard, stepped out into the cold night air. Our breath floated like little ghosts, while the moonlit path to the cellar crunched under our boots. We surrounded the door like we were raiding a bunker. The old wooden door groaned open, echoing through the yard. At first, nothing. Then Claudia exploded out like she'd been shot from a cannon. Gasping, clutching her chest, stumbling dramatically like she'd spent the last hour wrestling demons in the dark. Her cashmere sweater was stained, her designer jeans blotched with beet juice, and her perfectly bleached hair looked like a bird's nest that lost a fight. The Claudia I'd come to know, cold, calculating, immaculately put together, was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she'd been camping in a compost pile. She blinked in the flashlight's glare, spotted Richard, and instantly flicked the switch. You ever watch someone snap into character mid-scene? That was Claudia. The second she saw her husband and the sheriff, her whole body shifted. Shoulders slumped. A delicate hand fluttered to her neck. Big, watery eyes locked on Richard. Greg, thank God you're here, she sobbed. He locked me in there like an animal. I was just out for my health walk. You know I do that every night. And I saw the cellar door open. I was worried a child might fall in. She looked at the sheriff like she expected applause. I had to give it to her. It was an Oscar-worthy monologue. She somehow managed to be the victim and a community hero in the same breath. Too bad for her. The evidence was already rolling. Richard stood still, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the bottle of weed killer peeking from behind a crate. Sheriff Granger didn't even blink. He raised his hand like a traffic cop, stopping Claudia mid-performance. Mrs. Berkeley, he said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut steel. We have video of you picking that lock with what looks like burglary tools, entering with chemicals, and attempting to contaminate Mr. Whitaker's food supply. Claudia froze. Not a twitch. It was like the spotlight had snapped off mid-scene, and just like that, the fantasy crumbled. There are multiple cameras, I said, voice calm, with clear timestamps. Let's not pretend everyone here is an idiot, especially not at midnight. And just like that, Claudia switched gears again. The fake tears? Gone, like someone turned off a faucet. Her whole body straightened, chin popped up like she was modeling righteous fury on a courtroom catwalk. "Those cameras are on my property," she snapped. "He had no right to film me. That's an invasion of privacy." Her voice cracked like a whip. "And you can't prove what was in the bottle. It could have been water." She waved a trembling hand toward the cellar, like the bottle was just some misunderstood jug of Fiji. Her eyes flicked to the camera above the cellar door, then darted toward Richard, looking for backup and not finding it. "Actually, Claudia," I said evenly, "this is my land, as confirmed by that property survey we paid for after your third-line dispute." I pointed to the cellar. "The cameras are legal. They're pointed at my buildings. And that drain you poured your little chemical cocktail into?" I let a smile creep in. "It doesn't flow into the sewage system. It empties into a sealed containment tank my environmental engineer buddy helped me install. For testing, we've got samples of everything you dumped." Her face turned pale so fast, it looked like someone had drained her like a wine glass. The flashlight caught on her foundation and blush, now stark against her ghost-white skin. It was the first time I'd seen real fear in her eyes. Not the dramatic, staged kind, but the kind that comes when you realize you're cornered and the walls are closing in. Richard saw it too. As Claudia opened her mouth to start another spin, he stepped forward and put a firm hand on her arm. When she tried to yank away, he tightened his grip. "Claudia, don't say another word." His tone, all lawyer, cold, controlled, done playing husband. He turned to Sheriff Granger, looking tired. "What happens now, Sheriff?" Granger didn't sugarcoat it. "Mrs. Berkeley, you're looking at serious charges. Breaking and entering. Attempted destruction of property. Possibly environmental violations, depending on what those chemicals test out as." He glanced at Richard, then at me. "Mr. Whitaker's open to a resolution, but it would require an honest explanation for your actions. Why have you been targeting him?" Claudia's jaw clenched. Her whole face twisted like someone had shoved lemon rind in her mouth.
"This is ridiculous. He locked me in a cellar. That's kidnapping."
"No," Sheriff Granger said flatly. "That's legal detainment. He caught you mid-crime, called me immediately, and ensured your safety. Vermont law is clear." Richard turned to his wife, and something inside him cracked. "Claudia, they have you on video. It's over. Just tell them the truth, because if you don't, I can't help you." She stared at him, long and hard, then turned away from all of us, gazing toward her fancy house like it might save her. And finally, she broke. "Fine," Claudia hissed. "You want the truth? Look up the property history. That precious family farm you're so obsessed with." She spat the words like poison. "It was once part of a Berkeley industrial disposal site. That name hit me like a punch. Berkeley. You mean your family's company?" I asked, already guessing the answer. Richard answered for her, his voice tight. "Her family, not mine. I took the Berkeley name when we married. Her father ran the company." Claudia glared at him, then continued. "This land was contaminated. Industrial waste. We were supposed to clean it up before selling it, but corners got cut. Your grandfather bought it cheap because no one told him the truth." Her voice dropped. "I was the waste management director. If anyone ever tests that soil, especially around the root cellar, the lawsuits would bury us." My head spun. It was like the ground under my feet, already questionable, tilted. "You've been trying to drive me out," I said, "because you're afraid I'll find what your family buried here." "It wasn't just me," Claudia snapped. "It was company policy. But when I saw you start digging, planting your little organic dreams, I knew you'd find something eventually. I tried to buy you out. That would have been clean. You said no, you were so obsessed with your legacy." She sneered on that last word, like it tasted rotten. Sheriff Granger had been quiet, arms crossed. Now he stepped forward, voice steady. "Mrs. Berkeley, are you admitting to covering up hazardous waste and illegal dumping?" The flashlight beam caught her face again. Except now, there was no anger, no smugness, just pure hollow dread. Richard took a step away from her. Just one. But it said everything. He folded his arms and stared at the dirt. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to continue this conversation once Claudia has legal counsel." Someone besides me. Sheriff Granger gave a slow nod. I agree. Mrs. Berkeley, I'm placing you under arrest for breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and, based on your own admission, potential environmental crimes. He pulled out the cuffs. And that's when it truly hit Claudia. Her story was over. Not with a court win, not with a hostile buyout, but with a pair of cold steel bracelets clicking around her wrists in the same cellar she'd tried to poison. You have the right to remain silent. Sheriff Granger read Claudia her rights with calm precision as he gently, but firmly, guided her toward his patrol car. Claudia, of course, kept protesting, loudly, still tossing out threats about lawsuits and massive legal consequences. But I just stood there, watching her go. After everything she'd done, I thought I'd feel some kind of victory, relief, maybe even joy. Instead, all I felt was hollow. It wasn't justice that left me cold. It was seeing a person, even one like Claudia, crumble under the weight of her own lies. As I stood there in the gravel driveway, Nina Caldwell, my friend and environmental consultant, walked up beside me. I'd texted her earlier, and she'd arrived just after the commotion started. You don't seem as happy as I figured you'd be, she said gently. I'm not, I admitted. Looking at her now, I just wonder, what turns someone into that? Is it greed, fear, or just being terrified of the truth? I glanced back toward my farmhouse, lit faintly in the moonlight. I've dealt with her, but what about the land? Is it even safe anymore? Nina promised to help me test the soil thoroughly, and if it came to it, she'd help me figure out how to clean it up. Before he left, Richard approached me. The man looked exhausted, like he'd aged a decade in one night. I had no idea, he said, voice quiet. I'll make sure you're compensated. My firm can't take your case, but I'll connect you with some of the best environmental attorneys around. You have my full cooperation. In the following weeks, my 5 acres became a science zone. Nina brought in a full team from her consulting firm. They showed up with lab gear, soil testing kits, and more hazmat suits than a low-budget sci-fi movie. They dug deep, especially near the root cellar, where Claudia had basically pointed us to ground zero. It was both fascinating and terrifying to watch. Each night, Nina would lay out color-coded maps across my kitchen table. We're finding consistent patterns, she told me one evening, pointing to a red zone on a laminated sheet. The good news? It's mostly localized. The bad news? This stuff is serious, persistent organic pollutants. PCBs, dioxins, heavy metals. Her finger landed right where my garden had been. Did your grandfather ever say nothing would grow well here? And just like that, I remembered. He used to call the east side stubborn dirt. That's why he built the garden on the western edge instead. He hadn't known what it was, just that something wasn't right. He protected us without even realizing it. When we tested the produce I'd stored, contaminated, not lethal, not glowing green, but enough to shake me to my core. I'd been so proud of that harvest. Now I could barely look at it without feeling sick. Meanwhile, the EPA and state agencies got involved. They tested the soil, the air, the water. Subpoenas flew. Berkeley Chemicals records were dragged out of dusty storage. Retired employees came forward with stories. One man, an elderly night watchman, described trucks dumping barrels into shallow pits during the 70s, under cover of night, on land that now had my name on the deed. Turns out it wasn't just my property. Other parcels sold off by Berkeley Chemical decades ago were tested and found contaminated too. What started as a personal property dispute had cracked open a full-blown environmental scandal. Class action suits were filed. The successor company, which had bought out Berkeley Chemical long after the dumping, was suddenly in the crosshairs of federal and state regulators. It was poetic justice in a way, but it didn't bring my farm back. Claudia's campaign of harassment? It was never just about me. It was about covering up decades of corporate greed and recklessness. And now it was all out in the open. By spring, the remediation began. The corporate successor, eager to avoid annihilation in court. agreed to fund the total cleanup of every affected property. That meant moving out. Temporarily, they said. Crews in hazmat suits scraped away 3 feet of contaminated soil from the red zones. They filtered the groundwater. My garden beds were dismantled, the greenhouse torn down. Even the root cellar, my grandfather's pride and Claudia's downfall, was gutted and tested. Anything tainted was trucked out in barrels labeled hazardous waste. I moved into a small apartment in town and watched the land transform from a distance. I'd visit the farm every few days, walk the perimeter, talk with the crews, just check in. But it wasn't the same. The farmhouse stood alone in a landscape of churned dirt and construction tape. The chickens were temporarily rehomed. My garden was a memory, not a plot. Still, something held me to that place, something that couldn't be bulldozed. Neighbors who once gave me the side eye now showed up with support. Casseroles, coffee, even just quiet company. Mrs. Ellsworth, the same sweet woman who once brought me homemade jam, came to visit one evening. She watched me study the bare field, then said, "Land remembers, Ethan, but it forgives too." "This soil knew your grandfather's care," Nina said one night as we sat hunched over blueprints, coffee steaming beside us. "And it'll know yours again." She wasn't just offering technical support anymore. Our late nights discussing remediation plans had turned into something more personal. As we sketched out a future for the land, our friendship had quietly deepened into something else. "This doesn't have to be the end of your dream," she said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. "It can be the beginning of something even better." That's when it clicked. The poisoning of this land wasn't the final chapter. It was a chance to write a new one. My grandfather had unknowingly bought tainted ground and coaxed life from it anyway. Now I had a shot at healing it fully, restoring not just the farm, but everything it stood for. Each week, as Nina's tests showed signs of improvement, I felt a quiet sense of purpose settle in. This wasn't just about carrots and cucumbers anymore. It was about restoration, about turning something broken into something vibrant again. And that idea, it kept me going. 1 year later, I sat in the back row of the county courthouse, watching Claudia Berkeley face her reckoning. The trial had drawn attention from across the country. Everyone loves a scandal, especially when it involves money, environmental crimes, and a villain as arrogant as Claudia. The courtroom was packed. Journalists scribbled. Activists stood along the walls. Even some neighbors, folks who'd once doubted me, had come to witness this. The trial dragged on for months, but the evidence only got worse. Internal memos, falsified cleanup reports, a secretary who had saved everything. Financial records proving Berkeley Chemical had saved over $22 million by illegally dumping toxic waste. Medical records of 3 locals who'd developed rare cancers, directly tied to the exact chemicals in my soil. And Claudia, she sat there through it all with that same smug look she'd worn when she first complained about my hens. Like none of it could possibly stick to her. Like her last name would wash it all away. Her lawyers tried everything. Blame the dead, question my video footage, paint her as a misunderstood executive. It all fell flat. The truth was louder. When the judge finally read the verdict, you could feel the air shift. "Claudia Berkeley," she began, her voice echoing through the silent room. "This court finds you guilty of 24 counts of illegal toxic waste disposal, 16 counts of falsifying environmental records, 12 counts of perjury, and 1 count each of breaking and entering and attempted destruction of property." She didn't stop there. The judge looked Claudia dead in the eye. "Your actions have endangered the health of children and families, all to protect money and reputation. This court finds that particularly despicable. 7 years, federal prison, no early release, $5.2 million in fines, and a court-ordered public apology in national newspapers. Even the prosecution hadn't asked for that much." Claudia wobbled slightly when the sentence was handed down. Her jaw tightened, eyes darted around like she was still trying to find a way out, but this time there wasn't one. For the first time in all this, she looked afraid. Not of what she'd done, just of getting caught. She still wasn't sorry, just furious. As the bailiff led her out in cuffs, she glanced back at me. Our eyes met. No apology, no regret, just raw resentment. And all I felt was sadness. Because somewhere along the line, Claudia traded in her humanity for control. And now all she had left were shackles and headlines. Outside the courthouse was a wall of microphones and reporters. I'd avoided the press the whole time, but today I'd prepared a statement. I stepped forward, flanked by Nina and other victims of the contamination. I took a breath and began. Today isn't about revenge, I said. It's about accountability. What Claudia Berkeley did wasn't just an attack on my farm. It was an attack on every one of us who believes clean air, water, and soil are basic rights, not privileges. I paused, letting the camera zoom in. My grandfather always told me, land is a trust, something you care for, not just own. Today, that trust has been honored. That clip went viral in hours. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag root cellar justice. Hashtag Claudia Seller. Over the months that followed, people across the country sent letters, donations, even seeds. One woman from Colorado sent me hand-labeled tomato varieties with a note, "Keep growing." The land began to recover. So did I. My dream didn't die, it evolved. With Nina's help, we began transforming the property into a teaching farm, focused on land restoration and sustainable practices. School groups visited, scientists came to learn, and neighbors who once whispered behind their fences now brought over pies and seedlings. The soil still held scars, but it also held potential. Because when you care for something, even broken ground, it finds a way to bloom again. It didn't take long for Claudia's courtroom scowl to become internet famous. People plastered her mug across memes. Her sneer next to stills from my security footage. The captions, brutal. When you lie, dump toxins, and still think you're the victim. My personal favorite was, from HOA Queen to Cell Block C. Environmental groups called it a landmark moment. An actual executive held personally responsible for corporate pollution. Law schools started using the case in their curriculum, and then the documentary offers rolled in. I eventually signed with a filmmaker who cared more about telling the truth than chasing clickbait. The result was Underground Truths, the Root Cellar Case, a film that won awards, sparked national discussion, and honestly, brought a lot more attention than I'd ever expected. 2 years after Claudia began their sentence, the farm looked completely different, and in the best way. The remediation was done. The soil and groundwater were healing. The old farmhouse had been renovated top to bottom, and Nina helped install a fancy filtration system to keep the air inside clean. Even the greenhouse had made a comeback. This time with test plots for phytoremediation, showing how plants could pull toxins from the soil. But the biggest transformation, the root cellar itself, we didn't just rebuild it, we reimagined it. Half was now a working storage space, demonstrating old-school food preservation. The other half, a compact museum dedicated to land recovery, environmental crimes, and accountability. We had it all on display. Core samples showing soil before and after remediation, interactive maps, infographics about PCBs and dioxins, and in a glass case, under soft lighting and next to a plaque that read, "One bottle, one truth," sat the very container of weed killer Claudia tried to use that night, the one that started it all. It wasn't just a symbol of her crime. It was proof that sometimes the thing meant to destroy ends up revealing what needs to be rebuilt. Nina and I got married that summer. Just a quiet ceremony on the property, surrounded by wildflowers and the same native plants we'd used to heal the soil. Our wedding favors? Seedlings that clean the earth, each one in a little pot made from materials salvaged during cleanup. My life in Boston felt like it belonged to someone else. This land had become something neither of us had imagined. Part working farm, part environmental education center, part living laboratory. Kids came from schools across the country, their eyes lighting up as they learned how soil could carry secrets and how science could uncover them. We even partnered with universities, turning the property into a research site for cutting-edge remediation tech. And Richard? He quietly divorced Claudia, dropped the Berkeley name, and started over. Every now and then, he sent handwritten updates. He'd switched his law practice to represent victims of environmental contamination, often pro bono. "I can't undo what she did," he once wrote, "but I can help make it right." As for Claudia, well, prison didn't exactly suit her. News stories painted the picture. Gone were the designer blazers and manicured nails. In their place, gray roots, state-issued sweats, and a scowl that had become her trademark. The inmates called her Claudia of Cell Block C. Most avoided her, said she still demanded special treatment, still refused to admit she did anything wrong. One reporter who interviewed her said Claudia still believed the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that her only mistake was trusting the wrong people. It was sad, really. Not because I pitied her, but because even after everything, she still couldn't take responsibility. One afternoon, I was leading a group of environmental science students across the fields when a young woman raised her hand. "Do you ever feel sorry for Claudia Berkeley?" She asked it kindly, not as a challenge, just genuine curiosity. I looked out at the same soil that had once been poisoned, now green, now thriving. "I feel sorry," I said slowly, "that someone can become so disconnected from their actions that they choose to poison land and people instead of facing the truth." I turned back to the group, but I don't regret that justice was served. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we earn. Claudia needed to face hers, and this land, it deserved the chance to heal. Later that evening, Nina and I stood at the edge of the property, watching the sun melt behind the trees. The fields shimmered golden. Life, growth, redemption. "You know what's funny?" I said, pulling her close. "If Claudia had just left me alone, I probably never would have found out about the contamination." "She tried to run you off," Nina said, "and ended up exposing everything she was trying to bury." We stood there in silence for a moment. "There's probably a lesson in that," she added, resting her head on my shoulder. "Yeah," I said. "Like sometimes, locking a Claudia in your root cellar is exactly the right move." We laughed, deep, easy laughter. And behind us, the land just kept on healing. If you liked this story, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And we are also happy to announce that we have created a playlist that contains all the best Karen HOA stories. You can see it on the screen now. Click to play it. I assure you, you will laugh like never before. Thank you for watching.